Hello, I'm Marcia Witch. Welcome to From the World Up. Today we're talking about that oldest profession, prostitution. Okay, first up, I apologise for my cat. She's in a bad mood and she won't shut up. There are around 42 million prostitutes in the world. It is known as the world's oldest profession for a reason. As long as there have been people having crafts, there have been those whose craft is their body. If you are writing a matriarchal society, I would consider making your prostitution have a degree of consistency in it. So either the male or female equivalent of a mistress or a concubine, rather than visiting in the way that you would visit a dentist. Because I did a Twitter poll, most like 70% of women are more likely to say no to the question without taboos, would you use a prostitute or a male prostitute or a female prostitute as an alternative to dating. Of course, we live in a patriarchal world. There are very few pockets of matriarchal power left in the world, almost all of them tribal. And so it is very, very difficult to get a read on anything from a pure unbiased point of view, unless you talk to autistic people. And speaking as an autistic person, I don't really see the problem. If I could afford a prostitute, I probably would get one. Right, moving on. The patriarchal values don't just change, therefore, whether or not there is a taboo towards prostitution. It would also change what prostitutes look like. If you take your mental image, it's a very slender body but with large breasts, therefore emphasizing the weakness of body that can be overpowered, but also the reproductive organs and the reproductive uses of a woman, having that large breasts, very skinny. If you think of what you imagine a male prostitute or a gigolo to look like, it's very much sort of like the pretty boy, very slender, things like that. Because again, somebody in this kind of society, if you're paying for it, you want to dominate it. In a matriarchal society, I would consider more the gladiatorial Conan the Barbarian type, who might be put out to stud, who might be warriors who are then visited. Like that line in Gladiator, the film, where she pretends to be able to get in to talk to him by pretending to be a noblewoman who just wants to have her wicked way with him. It's that kind of thing, of the idea of a woman might want to possess someone for reasons other than they fit a mental image. Which is not to say that women don't objectify men. We do. I certainly do. But we objectify often for different reasons. In the same way that a man might objectify a woman for having large boobs, a woman is just as likely to objectify a man because he looks like he's nice. And believe me, I hate that about my gender. It has been said throughout history that prostitutes should be legalized to protect innocent women and innocent men from the violence and lust and rapine tendencies. Sorry, it's my cat irritating me again. Tendencies of men. This is said by the present incel movement and also St. Augustine. As far back as the 1000s, I think, St. Augustine, possibly earlier, not entirely sure. But it's something that male chroniclers come back to, is this belief that women should be sacrificed on the altar of male violence, and that prostitutes are the way to do that. If you want to have this vocalized in your book, it should be vocalized from a villainous point of view. It is not fair for prostitutes to be raped or to be exposed to the more violent aspects of human nature just to spare those who are not prostitutes. It's just ridiculous. In addition to this, in the medieval era, prostitutes were thought to be beneficial for fidelity. In that if a man was sleeping with a prostitute, he wouldn't have an affair. The general concept here is that it is so difficult for men to stay faithful, which we all know is not actually true. And so have a look into the fact that the court had a marshal, among whose jobs was to select courtesans, so that for those civil servants who were working with the king had access to clean, high skill prostitutes to select from, and from which to select. And also have a look into the Winchester geese. During the 12th century, the Bishop of Winchester was in charge of all the prostitutes in London. The phrase goose walking on your grave, that's because prostitutes used to hang out in cemeteries. So the idea is like, oh, there's a prostitute standing on my future gravesite, is technically what you're saying when you say that. And it's from this concept of the Winchester geese. Really interesting. Recommend you look into it if you want to have a centralized prostitution. Prostitution, the taboo, have gone hand in hand throughout history. In a prohibitive society, which most of them have been, the only way to explore any kind of non-missionary style heterosexual sex has been through prostitution. So for any kind of kink has to be explored through a paid route, because there is no alternative. Prostitution is a very good way to find out, whereas using a prostitute is a good way to find out if something is a kink or if it's just a curiosity. Whether you are actually dedicated to, for example, a BDSM lifestyle or relationship is best tried out once rather than, committed to straight off, and then for you to disappoint both of you by finding out that actually, no, you can't go through with that. In a prohibitive society as well, there's a degree to which standing could be lost if you started a relationship with somebody who then talked about your secrets from the bedroom outside. And obviously in an Abrahamic society, there is such a stigma against any sexuality that is not cis-hetero, that there would be a huge amount of shame put on somebody if they expressed any kind of interest, and the only way to act on that kind of desire or natural instinct would be through prostitution. If you are doing that kind of society, either matriarchal or patriarchal, where one sex in a bigendered paradigm is less important than the other, you need to consider whether prostitution is worse or better than marriage. Do you have children being married off at a young age? Do you have, people in like that sort of Austen era mindset of having to marry a rich husband in order to protect the rest of their family, which is in itself a form of prostitution? And whether or not that society permits a range of sexualities, or if heteronormative is the only one in your world. If that is so, I would encourage you to either make that to be seen in a bad light, because otherwise you're a bad person. Yep, I'm going to say that. I would also, if you're looking into the sexuality aspect, you might be interested to know that in the 14th century, for example, brothels were not just legalized, but encouraged by the church, not to combat infidelity this time, but to combat homosexuality, because they thought that if there were more women available, then the gay men wouldn't be gay anymore, or bless. And that is contrasts to like the ancient Greek attitude, which was basically, if you want to put your dick in it and you're prepared to pay for it, psh. Obviously they still had a very imbalanced gender thing, but sexuality was not as much of a problem. In the Roman context, it was perfectly acceptable for a man to put his dick into another man, but there was a huge amount of taboo and shame to being the guy that received. So that was fine if you were going to a brothel and they were all out of women, provided you didn't get anything put in yourself. I don't understand that. I have never been able to understand that mindset. I don't think that's just the autism. I'm going to move on then to the Romans in just a bit. But yeah, I think that's really important. If you're going to be writing a prohibitive society, prostitution is a really, really good way to do it, because even if they force the prostitutes to be outside the city limits, as was the case in Christian cities throughout the medieval era, for example, Chester's Love Lane, just on what is now really considered the town centre, that was outside the city gates, and it was where all the prostitutes lived, worked. So that is a strong theme throughout all three Abrahamic nations, not nations, religions, but they tended to they like having the prostitutes, they just have to be slightly out of town. For example, the city of London, Southwark was counted outside the city, and that's why all the prostitutes lived there, because again, it was outside the city bounds. So yeah. While people shouldn't be ranked, there are certainly different ranks of safety and autonomy within prostitution as a whole. Whether somebody is an owned slave of a brothel or a husband, once you are owned for nothing but sex, that is pretty much the most vulnerable a sex worker can be. Then probably the next one up is a streetwalker who has a pimp and therefore has somebody that they have to answer to, and who doesn't get to choose their own clients. Then a brothel, again, who doesn't get to choose their clients and possibly has no share, but in a medieval context has a roof over their head, and hopefully regular meals. Then the next one up from that, although they might not have a home, would be a streetwalker who does actually have autonomy, who can choose their own clients, who can choose where they go and can always say no, which is, I think, at the very least, if you're trying to present a positive version of prostitution, you should have nothing below that. Autonomy is the first and most important aspect that must be considered. Excuse me, there is a plane going overhead and I am running out of time, so I'm just going to have to wait till it passes. So the next step up from that is being either having a house or sharing a house with a group of other women. I believe that, although obviously the term is not applicable as an alternative to prostitutes, when it was, there were geishas who owned houses, and the house wasn't exactly a brothel, but these women were able to have a single place where they could each bring clients back. The next step up would be owning a share in a specialist house, such as a bathhouse. I'm going to go into bathhouses in a bit more detail in a bit. And therefore, they would have protection, potentially medical benefits, depending on whether or not you're writing in a medieval context or not. I've read books where there were doctors who specialised, that's the word I'm looking for, in brothels. And, for their room and board would live in and then seek extra clients when they needed it. After this level and the level of having a share in a house or a bathhouse, we're getting up to courtesans who were more prized. Again, a courtesan, in the terms of somebody who is a prostitute at a court and still doesn't have autonomy, that's not a positive role to go. They can be very useful narratively and politically. If anyone has ever seen Dangerous Beauty, the way that they portray the moment that Veronica Franco is coerced, emotionally and politically coerced, into sleeping with the King of France in order to save her city-state, or rather to bolster their navy, is a really good example of how you could have all the riches and the position in the world, but coercion is still coercion. The really good portrayal of courtesans, a really good portrayal of courtesans is actually that in Firefly. And don't be pretending you haven't seen Firefly, because if you haven't, I'm hoping that you are not old enough to listen to this podcast. They're very similar to the Oirans in Japan, and like even the Teiyus in Japan, in that they have autonomy and communication with each other, which means that they can blacklist somebody who is violent or has an STD, and things like that. And that is the best level, pretty much, for a society in which there are courtesans, is to ensure that you have it in your world that they have the ability to say no. Otherwise, you are glorifying a form of sex slavery rather than representing prostitution in a positive light. The next two are a mistress who has an owner for, which is difficult to phrase, somebody who has chosen a single client or a single patron. For example, in a lot of Regency novels, the heroine will start out as a courtesan because it is the only way to write sexually aware women in that era, is to write a widow or a courtesan or both. Now, there's a degree to which those women will also will lack autonomy if they have a cruel client who won't let them go, for example. And that's just one of my favourite stories, and are in need of help in order to stage their own rescue. That's a really good narrative device, but be careful and leery of portraying these women always as bad people. In Heya era Regency books, for example, the only time courtesans and mistresses are ever mentioned are as these selfish bitches who treated the virgin's future husband in a bad way because they were so selfish and mean and wanted money and presents, even though that was their way of supporting themselves and potentially families. So be leery of that. And of course, the absolute best one to be, it would be a dominatrix style mistress who not only has autonomy but has control over her clients and can pick and choose and has the upper hand, is the alpha to their beta, and therefore is in less risk of being controlled or badly treated. So yeah, those are some of the different types, and the different, again, rankings isn't the right word because I'm not saying that one is a better person than the other, but certainly that it is a better career path to be a mistress than it is to be a pimped streetwalker. I'm going to run down a few different types to give you some inspiration, and hopefully to help you think about different ways to approach prostitution in your world. The first I'm going to talk about, which obviously fits in very nicely with a fantasy construct, is the idea of sanctified prostitutes. So priestesses who can be approached for sex or who use it in rituals. In ancient Rome, ancient Greece, obviously these women were found, and it was only with the conversion to Christianity that the approach to women and to prostitution changed so dramatically into taking the Abrahamic view of shaming women for their promiscuity and the negative concept of promiscuity. I'm going to move on quickly because I'm pissing myself off talking about it. But anyway, these days the only example really is the Devadasi. I think I pronounced that right, in some Hindu temples. And there is a lot of controversy around about them and choice anyway. Yeah, that idea of priestesses who are sexually active and who use that sexual activity as a form of worship. Sex was a huge part of a lot of pagan rituals, but I might do that as a separate podcast someday. I've already mentioned the Winchester geese. It's a really good way of like saying that one civil servant, male or female, or one religious leader, male or female, is in charge of regulating the prostitutes. It can be very amusing simply because of the long-suffering nature of that kind of leader. And it was in the 12th century, late 12th century, the Bishop of Winchester was sort of given this job, didn't want it. It wasn't like he was a slut and he was like, give me all the prostitutes. It was that the the king sort of said, I need this organized, and by the way, I need taxes to fight the French, because I always need taxes to fight the French. Why don't we start taxing the prostitutes more and make it illegal for anyone to be a prostitute who isn't registered through the crown? Who's going to deal with it? And it just got assigned to the Bishop of Winchester. The phrase geese walking on your grave comes from the Winchester geese. Please, seriously, look into the Winchester geese. It's just, I want more. I think I want crime-solving books about them. Anyway, the next step is considering that brothels can be regulated. In the 1800s, the French and Russians both did this. They both had like state registration for brothels, and then had like inspectors going around to make sure there were no STDs or STIs going around. And that level is it's sensible. It means it would be as commonplace as when you get certifications in restaurants for cleanliness and things. And that is I think a really very clever, very good use of world history to build your own world. I would really recommend doing that. If you're going back to the prohibitive side of things, is the idea of them being outside the city walls, either with like a red light district, or just as in like an encampment, or just that the second you go out, it's like stepping into Las Vegas. And then whether or not Southwark, the whole freaking borough of Southwark, turned into the playground of London, and then ended up by the late 1700s, it had turned into like vice and danger and things like that. But that was because in the medieval era, it was legal to have a prostitute, for prostitutes to be in outside the city of London in Southwark, and cheaper because they didn't have to pay taxes to the Bishop of Winchester. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting over-involved and overexcited. One of my favorite ever aspects of prostitutes in history is the way that the Roman camps, they would all have a brothel, in the same way that these days you might say, okay, so on this RAF base, we're going to have a dentist. And because there were auxiliaries from all over the world, the brothel would have like a kebab shop style menu. So you could go in and say, okay, I'll have a number 3. Can I get that with foreplay? Okay, awesome. I'll have a number 3 with foreplay, and then I'll have a number 6. And I love that. Also, you would have men and women in these brothels, provided you were not receiving from a man. You would lose no standing within your, what are they called? Roman group of soldiers. My brain's gone a little bit blank. Regiment. Well, in your regiment, you wouldn't be looked down upon provided you were giving. So if you got in there and they're like, I'm sorry, everyone's busy, but we've got, Toby, then you could fuck Toby, you just couldn't get fucked by Toby. That kind of prohibitive stuff, that just makes no sense to me. That absolutely no sense. Please, in the comments, explain to me why the Romans thought it was, fine to give and not to receive. It's probably a patriarchal thing, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, yeah, I really like that whole kebab shop style set out. It's also interesting that the Roman prostitutes were called she-wolves. I think linking into the whole Romulus and Remus thing as a sign of respect, because they were these kick-ass women who, were giving pleasure and taking pleasure and all the rest of it, rather than the wives and daughters and sisters kind of aspect. But cool nicknames, always a good thing. Just in anything. And a nickname like she-wolves is fantastic, especially considering that the Romans venerated wolves to such a degree. In the Ottoman Empire, the bathhouses were usually had male prostitutes in them. But in modern fantasy, I know there is a lot more of bathhouses being used as an aspect of brothels. I really love it because I like going to spas, so the idea of being able to go to a spa and then get sex would be fantastic. Yeah, any fantasy that has that in there is obviously written by an intelligent and wonderful human being. But yeah, because it normalizes it, that it's a treatment rather than a taboo. So if you're trying to write a society which has prostitution but which doesn't have the same Abrahamic restrictions on sex, that might be a good way to go about it. Is to have bathhouses where it's just another treatment, again, the number 2 with foreplay. Women who are prostitutes have always been separated from other women very visually. In medieval Russia, a pale-skinned woman was assumed to be a prostitute because the cold wind or the summer sun hadn't coloured her cheeks. So if you have pale skin, you were in danger of being, called a prostitute. In the same way that you wear a short skirt in America, you might get called a prostitute. In medieval and Renaissance Italy, the colour was red. For women to wear. In other places in the world, prostitutes were made to wear yellow skin or just yellow scarves or a knot of yellow at their shoulder. That was one of the ones I read. Some kind of identifying feature, ostensibly to protect those who are not prostitutes, but also so that men didn't get their faces slapped. Talking about Italy, it was in Italy that the Chopin shoes were worn. Those are those massive, great big platform high heels, which were up to 24 inches high. And they were actually assigned to prostitutes because they were becoming fashionable and women kept twisting their ankles. So they thought if we make prostitutes wear them, then other women won't want to, which is just not how things work. We've already talked about being separated by either city walls or being put into red light districts. But the main separation, of course, would be education, since education of women was seen as such a terrible thing to be, to quote Dangerous Beauty, promiscuity of the mind leads to promiscuity of the body. If you read stuff, then you're going to turn into a whore, because you'll learn that men aren't just special. Which is kind of like the mindset of a medieval and Renaissance, up to the Renaissance and in the Victorian era, was that if women learned stuff, then they'd realize that men didn't deserve to be in charge and that equality was a thing. It's actually was the same mindset as white Americans used against black Americans for many years in the last century and to a degree at the moment, because if you don't educate people, and if you have the control over what education they have access to, then they won't question being treated as a lesser species. They'll just accept that they are being treated in such a way. But when you read books and you find out that actually white people or men are just as fallible as you are yourself, then why should they be in control? So education is a huge way in that women can be controlled. And that made, to spin it around, that meant that courtesans were some of the most educated women in the world, and some of the most literate and literary women of various time periods. You can flip it around, and if you're having a matriarchal society, you need to consider whether you want to have the same thing. So marriageable men are kept stupid, and therefore male prostitutes are trying to be more intelligent and read more and things like that, or whether you want to do away with that entirely, and just assume that women want everyone clever. I mean, I'm not going to be snarky. You know what? It's too easy. Too easy. Anyway, all this links into this idea of slut shaming, the idea that you need to be able to point out a prostitute and say she is a slut and she is not worthy of interest, and stopping your sweet innocent daughters from talking to somebody who is a prostitute. So if you are going for a prohibitive society, you need to consider that, the fact that they usually had a way of keeping the prostitutes separate from marriageable women. Also, obviously, consider health. If you're going to have a realistic fantasy setting, not fantasy realism, but a realistic fantasy setting, you need to consider whether or not STDs and STIs exist. I've already mentioned the Russian and French regulating to keep those out, and out of the regulated brothels. But these kind of things link into the whole idea of stigma and disassociating nice, good, honest citizens from prostitution. As I personally think that a lot of that sprung out of the idea of not wanting to get caught. You know, if you know that you're not going to go down the street and go, wait a minute, isn't that daddy? If it's regulated as well, you get to stop the abuse of minors and the concept of taking people who are underage and transporting them to another place. Again, prohibitive society is a really good way to get a abuse victim from one place to another. But speaking as a woman, please, if you are a male character, not a male character, a male writer, women are allowed to have backstories that don't involve sexual abuse. Just so you know, just thought I'd share that. People should never be a commodity, but people are frequently used as a commodity, as I discussed to a degree in my slavery podcast. So if you're going to have that kind of evil, acknowledge it. Don't try and brush over your prostitution. If you're going to have evil, prohibitive society, then write that, but don't try and write everybody else being happy, but prostitutes still being abused and exploited. Prostitutes are people too, and they're people with a skill set. And if you are fine with assassins, you have to be fine with prostitutes. And if you're not fine with prostitutes, have a long hard look at why. Because it may well be the indoctrinate aspects of living in a patriarchal society. So yeah, I would say consider those things. I would also say have a look at a website called dirtysexyhistory.com. That's where I got a lot of this information from, and it's very good at writing about social aspects of history, which obviously the history books until very recently just ignored because they weren't fit for academia to talk about. Okay, yeah, that's me. I hope this has been useful and helps you build your world.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.